Koutou katoa and welcome, Territory 3 community. It's a fantastic pleasure to bring you another one of our Territory 3 Founder Life webinars, a little later in the afternoon than normal, but a beautiful day here in Wellington. Hopefully it's nice where you are. Welcoming Angie Judge from Dexibit. Very excited to hear her story, and I'll tell you why a little bit more. We were just chatting in the green room about when we first met, and yeah, I'm really keen to have her share with you the journey through building her business out to where she is today. Just a few housekeeping items before we get Angie to introduce herself. You're probably all familiar with Zoom by now, but you know, we've got a chat section which everyone generally tends to just put thoughts that come into their mind, and then we have a specific question and answer section, I should say, where I will make sure that we get through all those questions and answers. We'll stop actively at about minute 30 to answer what's there, and then we'll stop again at about 10:02 to make sure that what's foremost on your mind, if you've actually formed it into a question, we get Angie's perspective on. So thanks to all our sponsors that just make these webinars possible: New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, Amazon Web Services, Bank of New Zealand, Jasmine Investments, and Vendor Management, and K1W1. And so with all the housekeeping done, Angie, fantastic to have you here. I was reflecting, I remember meeting you at our first Kiwi landing pad jam some years ago. So it's great to be having this conversation so much further down the track, I think, when you were just thinking about this business. And the floor is yours to tell us a little bit about yourself and kick us off.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here. I think when I first met you, and we went along to that session of Kiwi landing pad, I didn't even know what I wanted to do. It was just that it was going to be something.
Brilliant.
So all these years later, here we are. So where do we start?
Well, really just tell us a little bit about yourself and the business, and then we can get into some questions. I've got a number that I'm keen to ask you, and I'm sure our community have as well.
Well, okay, so I am 38, 9 months pregnant, hence the very husky voice. It's not because I had a hard night. And a few years into the startup journey with Dexibit, we do big data analytics for visitor attractions. And our customers are US government, sort of larger end enterprise customers, primarily global, with a few here in New Zealand. And they are either cultural institutions or commercial attractions. We're software as a service. We take data from lots of different sources. You can imagine the last time you went to a theme park or a museum. You have a ticket, you might have a membership, you might buy something at the shop, eat at the cafe, and maybe leave them a review online, nice or not, maybe tweet something on social media. And so we draw all of that data up and pull it into dashboards and reports, and then use machine learning to do forecasts, natural language, and other things to give them insights and really help business stakeholders right across their organizations deal with data and action it and interpret it and understand it and use it to get more people through the door and get them engaged and spending more and coming back. And my journey to that, it's my first startup, came from corporate land. So I originally, studied in commerce, went and worked for a merchant bank in marketing, did a stint for 5 years or so at Hewlett Packard as a consultant, and then went and worked for an Israeli company in telecommunications. So I ended up in this field about network analytics and sort of helping telecommunications companies with data from their networks and making decisions about where to put infrastructure and things like that. And it was right at the height of sort of just as the cloud was coming in, and just as we were having to, the gold legacy provider, deal with the SaaS entrants coming into the market, and just as sort of big data was becoming a thing. And I don't think I really even knew much about machine learning at that point, but it sort of struck me that this was a really interesting part of technology, but I happened to be using it in a really boring industry. And so I really wanted to go and do something fun and applicable. And I think as a founder, when you're on the long journey of a startup, you kind of have to fall in love with your problem again and again and again, and your passion for your industry. And I'm so glad that we chose the most exciting place in the world to do that in visitor attractions. When the world isn't closed, I get to go to theme parks and stadiums and art galleries and all of these wonderful places, and just enjoy the experience of being there and being a part of it and seeing wild and amazing things. And it's made it a colourful journey.
It's very cool. It does seem like the dream job. And even better, I imagine you're welcomed slightly differently to visitors, because it's pretty clear, just from what you do on your website in terms of the messages to your customers, is that you basically help them get more customers, right?
Yeah, we certainly do get to see some of the parts of the visitor attraction that the general public might not access, and I've had the most incredible experiences of being the first person to, one of the first people to walk through new museums as they're opening, or new exhibitions as they're getting their final touches on, and it's just an amazing piece to be part of.
Fantastic. And it's a software as a service business as well, which I know that is on the agenda for many of our community members. But if we can walk back in time to that front row of that Kiwi landing pad jam, and your admission that you weren't probably quite in the mode of what you were going to do, but you knew you were going to do something. How did you shape that, and how did that become the path towards events and attractions as a marketplace?
I think I'd always known in my gut that I wanted to build a business. My father was actually a tech entrepreneur himself. He'd built and sold a couple of tech companies, and so for me, the kitchen table when I was 3 years old was strewn with software specs, and the phone in the kitchen was always running hot with sales calls and things like that. And that was my experience growing up. But he gave me a lot of advice over the years about that. Sort of 7 years old, I would get this is how you handle this kind of advice. But one of the pieces that stood out for me was, he said, go and make your mistakes in someone else's dime. And so I think I did that for a good 10 years or so before I felt that I was ready. I'd sort of done a few different roles, which the experience of that have helped through a startup. I would hate to, I know it can be done from seeing other people do it, but I would hate to sort of come into it fresh out of uni and not have sat in big sales pitch meetings and not have done marketing with a huge budget, and being able to sort of know how things work at scale and really have to figure that stuff out the hard way. So I think that really helped. But I think I'd reached a point in my career where I either needed to double down on climbing the corporate ladder, or it was time, and time in life, and that itch was strong enough. And I'd found a sort of area of technology that I loved. I was really attracted to this SaaS stuff after being, the legacy on-prem provider with all of its problems, and then it became about finding a space and a problem to fall in love with. And I think you have to have that. You can't come with a solution and be like, here is this wonderful thing that I've built. You have to come and find that issue that is the inspiration for it all. And for me, that moment happened. I was at the Smithsonian, who are now one of our customers, and I was watching the clicker counter of the guard. They were manually clicking all of their visitors through, and they get tens of millions of visitors a year. And I was feeling very sorry for this security guard. And I was sort of imagining what happened after they were clicking people through. They probably write that on a clipboard, and they probably enter that into a spreadsheet, and then somebody else probably pulls that into, I don't know, a system, and then somebody else has to write reports and things. And I could imagine this whole sort of life cycle, right up to a director wanting to see data to make decisions at the other end, and just imagine a different way of that being done. And that sort of helped for me connect that problem space together, and then thinking about how that worked in the world at large, at scale, for visitor attractions everywhere. That became the passion.
And you've pretty much got the dream company features here, right? I think this was the list that every venture capitalist was changing their company bios to. You know, it's cloud-based, it's AI, it's analytics, and it's SaaS. So yeah, I don't think you could probably.
I think these days you need to add crypto and Web3 and a few other things, don't you? But,
yeah, we won't get started on crypto. But you're right, that's the new AI, isn't it? So, you know, you mentioned finding this issue, or finding this problem to solve, and I think I've just done some office hours down in Christchurch, and you know, certainly with the earlier founders and even some of the later founders just trying to, you know, refine and reinforce their business as they grow or even go into scale markets. I'm interested in your thoughts about how you actually went through that sort of problem establishment process with customers and validation, not just from the point of view of what the problems were, because I'm sure they told you a heap, and you know, as you said, you found a lot just by actually being in these attractions and museums and so forth. But how did you go about actually finding, you know, I guess the things like which were the most painful and which were the most logical to sort of kick your feature set off with, rather than just sort of having a whole bunch of lists and a lot of tech backlog?
Well, before we started Dexibit, I actually had an idea for another thing, and sort of looked at a mobile app and was playing around with that, and in the same space as well. And I went and talked to a bunch of people and tried a few things, and each one of them would ask me more about the data, and I would ask them a really simple question like, how many visitors do you get? And most of them couldn't tell me the answer to that question. And that sort of later on became like the pattern matching that indicated that there was a problem there. And what I didn't hear was the problems that really justified having apps in museums. And sure enough, I don't know, there's been dozens and dozens of companies that have tried it. There's always another 5 or 10 new ones every few months that come onto the market. And I think they all meet up with the same problem, is that it's not really a problem. And people don't really take them up and use them well, and then so they churn quite quickly, and all of these sorts of things. So I think just having those conversations with people in the industry that you want to work in, and hearing that pattern of things that they tell you, even if they're not the conversation that you're there to have in the first place, can help that interest point develop. A couple of, if we're going back to those really, really early days of sort of the day one stuff, another thing that really helped me was a museum, very kind museum director let me sit in her office for a week. And attend every meeting and hear what she talked about on the phone, and write to me about the various things that were happening in her world at the minute, and run around the museum and just be involved in random stuff. And that was so educational for me to really get to know a customer that closely. And then, yeah, it was just a matter of getting on a plane, going to industry conferences. One of the first ones I went to was the American Alliance of Museums, about 5,000 people who meet in DC at the time. And just sort of seeing the industry at scale really helped, you know, having 100 conversations rather than 5, doing it in America, not New Zealand, hearing what they talked about at conference, you know, that really helped sort of immerse in the industry. But these days at our stage, problem discovery is still as relevant, an important way of working than it was on day one. Like, you can never stop discovering the problem and learning more about your customer and your market and what they're facing. And of course, they're going through huge amounts of change at the minute. But, you know, a SaaS product is never done. And so the muscle of discovery is always one that you work to get better and better and better at. And we have gone through several iterations as a company and a team of how we do that. And I'm sure we'll have more in the future, but you can never stop trying to be better at that whole challenge of understanding a customer's problem very, very deeply. And it is so hard to remove the lens of our product when you're doing that, and get very real about whether something will be useful to them or not, and validate ideas as soon as you possibly can, rather than develop them and launch them and then wish you didn't. So yeah, I think you have to make a few mistakes and get a few scars and try a few different things. But if the team can sort of come to that discovery with as least amount of ego as possible and the biggest errors that they can muster, you can't go too wrong with doing that.
100% agree. I still remember Xerox bleeding and banging into us, finding the unarticulated need that customer kind of had. You know, they could tell you all the things they wanted, but you're kind of figuring that out. It never ends, as you say. So I'm going to stay in New Zealand in the early days, and you mentioned the Smithsonian before, but you know, looking at building this business from New Zealand, because this is a big thing for a lot of our founders, and sort of having some local, obviously, industry in your marketplace. But my question is, you know, were there any differences of significance? Obviously, there's a scale difference between Te Papa and Smithsonian, but how long did it take for New Zealand really to be somewhat irrelevant, if it did in fact become, in terms of where the opportunity for the business was?
We have never looked at the New Zealand market as a business opportunity for us. Our customers here, our customers who've come and approached us and said we need to have this, and obviously we wouldn't say no to that. They're not sort of a market that we have actively pursued. Not even Australia. We wanted to be in the US, so we went straight for the US. Beyond the US, we like the UK, so we go there a bit, and then sort of everywhere else becomes a inbound rather than outbound function for us. I think the advantage of the US is, and it is hard to get your first customer in the US when you're not a US company. It's really hard to get your first US government customer when you haven't been that before. But the advantage of US customers is they are brutally honest in sales and in success. So they will tell you when something's not working. A New Zealand customer will not. They will have meeting after meeting after meeting with you, and it will be very polite and nice, but you don't get the raw honesty that you need to learn about your customer and your product and whether it's solving a problem or not and all the rest of it.
You just get another coffee meeting.
Yeah, exactly. You have all sorts of nice conversations. And so I really appreciated that really raw, like, I'm not interested, you know, all of these sorts of things that were the no's, because they help you refine your messaging and your offering and your product eventually, and all the other things that you need to deliver on as a company in order to be successful. Where in New Zealand, that effect is muted, and so you have to try and read between the lines a lot more, and it's just not as efficient of a learning experience. There's also other things, like when you're raising capital, having a market in New Zealand is not that interesting. Having a market in the US is. When you're pricing something, you get a currency uplift, and US budgets tend to be larger. And Americans are a lot better at buying things, I think, than New Zealanders are. They know how to buy. They know that they're there to buy. They ask buying questions, and they are comfortable with having a buying process, where in New Zealand you sort of have to dance around all of that stuff. And that makes it harder to learn a sales method and discover what works for you as a business. It's a lot easier to actually achieve that stuff in the States.
Yeah, 100% agree. And just from, having identified that really New Zealand, Australia wasn't going to be your market in any respect, unless it was inbound, what was the biggest challenge, at any stage of the business for that growing, a lot of the infrastructure in the business from New Zealand?
And it's the last couple of years, of course, have been very hard. We haven't seen our team face to face for 2 years, which I could never have imagined doing. We went through phases as the company grew. At the beginning, it was fly in, fly out for me. We didn't have sort of staff over there. So I would go over to the States every few months, have as many meetings as I could and come back. And then that became, let's hire a couple of people over there. So we sort of became an employer. We registered a company over there so that we could have a local company to contract for, which is really important for an American customer. They don't want to be, who is this limited liability company in New Zealand, and what on earth am I going to get from them in terms of commitment? So they want an American Inc. company to deal with. At that point, you kind of choose where you're putting roots down, and that's a complex decision. The obvious choice is Silicon Valley, and then it's wrong for so many reasons. It's an incredibly expensive place to do business, and people build things on the West Coast and they buy them on the East Coast. So if you're in Silicon Valley, unless you're selling to Silicon Valley companies, your customer is going to be elsewhere and very wary of Silicon Valley. And so for us, we decided on DC because we were starting to work with the US Gov. It's a natural cultural hub. It's not too far away from New York. It's a nice place to live. All of these sorts of things worked out well for us. There is also downsides. The time zone sucks from New Zealand into the East Coast. It's an extra big leg on a plane. And yeah, there's other sort of considerations like government shutdowns and security things and stuff going on in DC that has certainly come into light in the last couple of years with what they've experienced locally there. And then it came time to sort of put down roots as an office. And then it was the business needed me over there more than it did here. And so it was spending more time there and having a base there for home and coming back to New Zealand every other month or whatever to maintain team here. And so that starts to become a real juggling act, getting leadership there and everything else. And then obviously that's taken a whole different track in the last couple of years with the pandemic that, I no longer fly to the US all the time. And I'm sure the post-COVID world, once our borders open, will probably look different again.
How many of your team are in New Zealand and how many are further afield?
So most are in New Zealand. All of our products and marketing, engineering is based here. And then the only functions we have in the US are sales and success, so the customer-facing functions. And I think we were just talking about this the other day. Can you do those things from afar? We've certainly found you can sell to other regions from the US. So like you don't necessarily need to be in the UK. You can sell into the UK from the States. It's hard to sell into the States from the US. From outside the US, they really enjoy talking to a fellow American who can understand their place in the world. And yeah, so accent and location and cultural understanding really helps for the American market, but then the rest of the world doesn't quite feel it quite so much when it's coming from America. And I think that's one of the tricky things as a Kiwi company. For some parts of America, it's hard to understand the New Zealand accent. There are some slight adjustments you can make, saying data rather than data, mobile rather than mobile. All of those sorts of things help. Avoiding using the word fortnight. There's that sort of natural thing of if you take a meeting at 4 o'clock in the morning, because you have to, you sort of don't want to expose that fact to a customer who would then otherwise feel really bad on the other end of the phone. So, there's all of those sorts of accommodations that you can make, but nothing beats American for the American market.
Yeah, I'm fascinated personally because I've not been to the US for I think nearly 3 years, and I normally would just jump off the plane and change accents.
Yeah,
it became a natural thing. So I'm not sure whether it's been 3 years out of the field, so I'm not sure what will happen to eventually get back there. But it is a big thing. Last week we had a very capable woman, Colette Zaro, who talked to us about managing remote teams and sort of the cultural aspects of that. I mean, obviously you being in that position. Around culture, what are your thoughts? What's changed, and what are your core sort of philosophical elements about that for Dexibit?
I think it's always been one of the hardest parts for us is matching a team here with a team there and trying to bridge that gap. And that's not just for the team, but for understanding of our customers as well. That can be little tiny things like I've been on the receiving end of this as well myself, working for an Israeli company. It's really annoying when you're staying up at 9 o'clock at night because someone else can't get out of bed before 10 o'clock in the morning, sort of thing. So we always try and make sure that our meetings that involve our US team take place, 8 a.m. sharp in New Zealand, because it's the least we can do when they're at the other end of their day, rather than, oh, there's only a few of them, so we'll just have it at a time that's convenient to us. So it's those sort of little considerations of being empathetic towards what it's like to be a regional office. There is the celebration of being a Kiwi company. It's not something we talk about much in the market because it's not a huge advantage to do so, but for a US employee working for a foreign company, and New Zealand's a very attractive brand for people, it's exciting. So, when you can bring them out to New Zealand and show them a great time and they get that experience, and teach them a bit about language and culture, and take them, Kiwi candy and get them to enjoy that, and sort of immerse them the reverse in our culture. I think the most challenging thing for us over the last couple of years has been trying to match the New Zealand experience of COVID with the American experience of COVID.
Yeah.
When you have people in the States who have lost family members, who have got sick with COVID themselves, who have the sound of gunfire outside their windows at night, and then you have a team in New Zealand who are worried that their holiday got cancelled or something. They are both human problems, but it is hard for the people on the other end to be as understanding than it is the other way around. And then it sort of flipped at one point where, like when we were in lockdown last year, in August, the rest of the world was opening up. And so it was about how do we leverage the experience of the American team to help our Kiwi team through their latest lockdown, that there is life on the other side, that once vaccinations come through, things look better. And the same now with Omicron. That it's still quite scary for us as New Zealanders because we haven't had Omicron. Talking to a staff member who had it last week, you can sort of get a lot more experience of firsthand of what that's like. Hearing about the wave being a bit more predictable, about sort of people going out and doing things and life returning to normal, it helps sort of the team here deal with the realities that we're facing at the moment. So sort of having these two very different tracks has been like the ultimate example of just how challenging managing a cross-specific culture is in a company.
But it sounds like, if I understand you right, you've just embraced that and recognised it and actually worked with folks to sort of bring that out and show the value of those two different perspectives. Yeah,
I think it's something you can never do enough of. You can never stop doing. Like, it's just a constant battle to bring those two worlds together. Battle's probably the wrong word. It's just a constant effort. You've just got to always have it front of mind, be thinking about what this feels like for someone in the States or wherever your remote office is, and be bringing that understanding back time and time again to the team here. Even little things like, they are voice of the customer. So how do you give as much airtime as possible versus if they were in New Zealand sitting in an office here, that they'd sort of naturally share that around the lunch table. That becomes an orchestrated thing, and you can never do enough of that either. No, it never stops. We're going to take a little break in a second for questions. So folks, if you do have any, just fire them into the Q&A box and we'll make sure we start off on those for a little bit, and we will make sure we finish them at the next question and answer break at about 10 to.
But just before we do that, Angie, from a software as a service point of view, I think your website for your customer proposition sort of sums it up in terms of the challenge for SaaS businesses, right? Because you drive visitation, which I sort of look at as the sort of original attraction of people first time, then their engagement with the product, being obviously a face-to-face thing for a lot of the events and the attraction side of things. And then there's the loyalty piece, which is really sort of, will they come back and will they tell others? From a software as a service perspective, what are your sort of key thoughts around those three blocks of, gaining customers, making sure they understand and actually start using the product, and then making sure they resubscribe?
Well, I think there's two interesting parts to that in totally different areas. The first is that for us, there's probably your choice to make when you go into a SaaS business of whether you go wide or whether you go deep. And for us, one of the core thesis behind our business was be really special to a select group of people and grow from there. Go after the niche markets at a global scale. It'll be huge. And that's what led us to make sure that we were always really set into the visitor attraction industry. It concentrates your discovery of your customers, it concentrates your marketing spend, your knowledge of the customer's problem, the way that your product does that, versus if you were to dilute that into a huge market like FMCG, or generally everybody's a customer. Yep. You can know your audience really well and find them really easily. But it means that you do need to solve quite a deep problem for them, versus like if anybody's your customer and you're something like Calendly, anybody needs to book a meeting and you can have this very thin slice, but across a very wide customer base. So I think thinking about that very consciously as to what it means for your business, and at what price point that then dictates, because of the unit economics involved in those models. But coming back to what that looks like for SaaS, we again, the very conscious decision is, do you want to operate at the top end of the market or the bottom, because you can't do both? And I don't know any better. I've only ever done enterprise sales and customer management in my career, so I didn't know any better than to only go after that. Our price point is a lot higher because of the fact that we are industry specific and that problem space is deep. So the value is significant. And what that means is that we have a marketing function, which is primarily thought leadership, a sales function, which is primarily assisted business development, not product-led growth, and a success function, which is sort of white glove versus sort of support desk stuff. So it influences your whole business model. Through the pandemic, though, that was challenged for us, because in enterprise sales model, you do things like you go to conferences and expos, and you call people up in the office on the phone, and you send them direct mail, because that still works in 2020 up until March. So we really had to rethink that. And for me, that was one of the really interesting pivots for us, as I was learning for the first time, because I'd never done it before, about sort of the world of product-led growth. And for a lot of our team, very few of them had been in that before. And we sort of found the right blend for us of borrowing bits of product-led growth into our enterprise sales model to make it work. So for example, now when you go to our website, rather than book a demo, it will say join free, which is sort of a clear indicator of a slight embrace of product-led growth. So you can now join free and get a little dashboard with Dexibit that gives you benchmarks of industry recovery, and you can manage your visitation stats in it. And obviously that data is very helpful for someone who does machine learning on predictions in the visitor attraction sector. But it was our way of coping with the changes and challenges that COVID presented, while still staying true to our roots, that we had chosen to be in a vertical. We'd chosen to be a deep product that was high value, that then needed to come in the top end of the market, and you can't suddenly slap $29 on the box and sell it to everyone out there in the world. And so making very conscious decisions about how you grow and the business model that sits behind that, I think is really important, because it filters down to everything. Our customer acquisition cost includes when we're thinking about marketing qualified leads, we can afford to spend $100, $200 on getting a lead in the door. If you're selling a product for $9 a month, that's probably not going to work for you. But if one of those deals will land 100G, then you don't worry so much about $100. So it's just sort of making sure that stuff is really conscious and you're thinking through the ramifications of it. And when you're listening to people like me talk, you have that lens of, oh, this is an enterprise sales company, or this is a PLG company, and you're not trying to compare the wrong apples with apples or take the wrong advice, because a lot of those things don't work when you try and take tactics from one and plug them into the other just because the numbers don't work.
Yeah, no, it sounds very smart, and it's certainly a topic that I'm hearing a lot about, and a lot of companies are still actually struggling, in my opinion, with the concept of increasing their resilience, i.e. staying with what they've got and just sort of hoping or reducing some cost elements to it, versus adaptability, where they actually look to, as you said, embrace some of the elements that you haven't had before, but in a way that actually is right for your business, not sort of think that it's a binary sort of one way or the other.
Yeah, we've done a bit of both, and the pandemic has sort of forced that thinking for us, I think, to a degree. It's given us the time and the opportunity to think bigger and solve problems that we might not have solved, because we've had the beauty of time. We had a time when all of our customers all over the world shut indefinitely, and that you can make really different product decisions when you do that, because you suddenly have this window on your hands that you never thought you would ever have. And so we use that to do modernization. When you build a product as a startup, you never build for what you want in year 10 on day one, because who knows if you'll keep it. You do the thing that suits for day 3. And so about the time that we're at in our journey is a very sensible time to take a look at parts of the product and say, actually, this needs an upgrade and we could do better on this. And now that we know everything that we know, we would do this completely differently. And so that's been enabled us to introduce sort of the next generation of Dexibit, which has been very timely for our customers, as they all then reopened and they had this beautiful new product to use. It's also enabled us to think about how we do take costs out and how we do automate more, whether that's in marketing or whether it's in customer onboarding and things like that, and build that into our planning as well. So we've probably made longer term, more strategic decisions because of the pandemic than we would have if we just kept on going at the rack-roll pace that we were on pre-pandemic.
Makes sense. I'm going to go over to our questions now. We've got one from Daniel, and it's about how you convinced your first customers to take a chance on your product. And then he's got a secondary question to that, or 3 questions actually. How you took first customers took a chance on your product. Second is how you settled on your pricing model. It's always a big one. And the third, then we can come back to them as we go as well, but what percentage of sales are through the customer making the first move, i.e. finding your website, versus the sales team finding potential customers? Thanks, Daniel.
Those are good ones. I'll pull them up myself because there's a few there. So I'll start with the first one, convincing your first customers. I think that is probably more about finding the right person as opposed to convincing. There are these special people out in the world who look for new things, and they're willing to take a risk, and they see things that other people do not see, and they are adventurous. and they exist in the business world, and you just have to find them. You talk to enough people and you'll eventually stumble across one of these people, and you'll know when you do. And those are the people that buy your products before other people. And they are the people that will also go to a conference and talk to other people about, and they'll go and do a press interview and they'll talk about that. And so some of the first customers that we had, we were very fortunate, were some very big names who were prepared to do that for us at a global scale. Te Papa were actually a fantastic, even though they're a New Zealand museum, they're very well respected on the international stage. And they went to a big conference in the US and talked about it. They went and talked to the various customers that we were getting on board in the States, and our industry benefited a lot from their early experience with us, as did we. Another one was the National Gallery of London. So, a huge customer on an international scale, but just the right magical people there who have that entrepreneurial spirit themselves. And yeah, they exist everywhere, so you've just got to find them. And it's not so much convincing them, because they know the risk, and they know what they're getting in for, and you have to be very upfront and honest with them about those things. But they are beautiful, beautiful customers to have, even if you don't keep them, because you will learn from them and gain value from them. So they are the people that you need at the very beginning.
Pricing.
Settle on pricing. So our pricing model is visitation based. I didn't want to go down the route of user based or seat based pricing, and the reason for that is a data product, an analytics product. You do not need data to do your job in most jobs, unless you're Ashley Bloomfield. And so unlike something like a point of sale product, if you buy a point of sale product, you need to use it to sell products. Like at some stage you have to make that commitment that you're going to make that change, and then everything you sell goes through that product. With a data product, one of the challenges is that people can always make decisions the wrong way without data. They don't have to look at metrics and understand them. They don't have to use a dashboard as part of their operations. And so one of the things that helps us when it comes to retention of customers is user breadth, depth, so adoption and then usage. And we want to do as much as possibly can to encourage that, rather than to strangle it with user-based licensing. And so we specifically don't charge based on users, because we want as many users as we possibly can. It will be as much harder to turn it off when 100 people are using it versus one. And it's also a big competitive advantage when we're going up against something like Tableau, where that very quickly becomes something that, we'll only get 2 licenses, only the analysts will use it. So it's a lot easier for us to displace a seat-based competitor. But we wanted something that would grow with the customer. And so we went with visitation-based pricing. It meant that we could appeal equally to mid-market as we could to enterprise. It made sense for our customers because that's how they think about their business. It's actually how they pay for other things like ticketing software sometimes. And so that's how we sort of came across that mode of working. We have experimented with other things, but nothing's worked for us quite so much like that. The downside to that is that when every venue in the world closes its doors and there are no visitors, is that you then have to have a come to Jesus moment about what you want to do. And for us at the time, when COVID hit at the very beginning, we were very fortunate. We had a very great financial position. We didn't have to worry about runway and things like that. And so we said, we need to do the right thing by our customers. We'll issue them with service credits while they're closed. We'll take the hit. This is an existential moment for our industry. We need to be there first and foremost for them. And it was the right thing to do, but obviously it's got financial effects. So I don't think in the business plan there was a pandemic when we could imagine that every venue in the world would shut. We actually thought the opposite, that through recessions, cultural institutions, most of them are government funded, they do pretty well. And people actually go to theme parks more during recessions because they want the escapism that comes with it. They tend to spend money on small things rather than big things like buying a car. They'll go to a concert instead. And so we hadn't sort of imagined a time when that would be the thing that we would face, but so be it.
Worst case scenario is usually about 30% downside, isn't it?
Yeah. But at the same time, a move like that earns you respect in the industry and people remember it as well. So that's been good. Percentage of sales through inbound versus outbound. For us, and again, this is a lens of enterprise sales. For every 5 customers that we talk to, 2 of them would have come inbound. This is in normal times, versus 3 would have been outbound. Usually of those 3 that were outbound, they've had some exposure to our brand through some other mechanism anyway, or heard about us through word of mouth and things like that. So that's not to say that marketing isn't uninvolved in those 3 outbounded, just that it didn't trigger the interaction with us. For those 2 out of 5 that are inbound, the sales team still take responsibility for the deal closure. So, and again, this is an enterprise thing. As soon as people spend over about $10,000 on something, generally you have more than one person involved in that decision. And so generally it becomes something more than, I'm going to buy this and put it on my credit card. And so generally you need a salesperson to start to coordinate that process, because it's an evaluation process, a buying process that they're going through. Might involve a CFO sign off, a procurement check, all of these sorts of things, and you've got multiple people at a table to come to an agreement on, and so that needs some massaging. So even if they are inbounded, they are as a result of sales.
Very cool, makes sense. Thank you, Daniel, for that question. And then our second question from anonymous attendee, who's almost on every webinar, actually. It's fantastic to see you again, anonymous. A lot of public sector customers in the US. How have you connected with those opportunities? And is it focused around RFPs and tenders, or is it outreach and marketing? And did you create your own market, so to speak?
Yes. So yes, we created our own market. When we started the business, visitor attraction analytics was not a thing. And we are still, fortunately, the only player in that space. I'm not saying we don't have competitors, because that's a silly thing to say. We compete with Tableau, Domo, Excel, doing nothing, click accounting. And so we did create the market and the drive, and that's pretty much what we do in marketing, is just thought leadership. We speak at conferences, we host webinars, we do podcasting, we blog, we issue playbooks and workbooks as gated content. So everything that we do pretty much in marketing is about building thought leadership and knowledge and momentum in this wave of where visitor attraction, are we on board with making insight inspired decisions or not? Then when it came to public sector customers, no, we don't do that through RFP and tenders. Well, yes, sometimes we do. If you're in the position, and this is just my opinion in sales, if you're in the position when you receive an RFP and you go and respond to it, your chances of winning it are pretty much nothing. You need to create the opportunity, and the RFP is part of the procurement. And so you need to be part of that buyer's decision-making process and thought process well in advance of that RFP even being talked about. Unless you are a commodity product, which hopefully none of us doing SaaS startups are, because there would be no point in just being another commodity product. And so sometimes for some customers, they have rules where to spend over a certain amount of money, it must go to tender. But there's a whole process that happens in buying an evaluation before that is even on the table. And you need to be involved there to win, rather than just get an RFP and be rent a crowd and responding. It's just a really easy way to waste a lot of your time and add no value and close no deals and miss out on all the ones that you could be.
Makes a lot of sense. We've got 10 minutes to run. I don't know about you, but it feels to me like it's gone very fast. We've covered a lot of ground in terms of just all the aspects of core aspects of building a business. I want to turn to te tangata now, people, and wellness, which we always ask of our guests. A big challenge, particularly for founders, but also for founders in respect of managing their team's wellness and doing the right thing by people around them. Really interested in your thoughts and insights around that topic.
Gosh, that's a big one. I think for anybody who's early on or starting out or thinking about it, the biggest thing to keep in mind for yourself is this will be probably the longest, hardest thing that you ever do. And the importance is not necessarily going fast or going hard. It's the resilience, endurance, the tenacity that will hold you for the journey, and being very realistic about the challenges that you will face along the way, because it looks so glamorous from the outside and you see these things in the Herald of so-and-so raised $10 million, yay. But what they don't talk about is of all the problems and pressures that will come along after that fact. That is a very long journey. And so particularly as a founding team, you have to talk about together about your expectations for that and get very real about it, and make some very solid commitments to each other about it. And it's why it's good to do it with somebody else and not on your own. I can't imagine doing it on your own, although I know people do and I admire it. It's a very scary thought, having to face those kind of pressures as a one. And then when you're in the thick of it, you have to find ways of managing yourself through. For me, I think the pandemic has been a good life teacher of the benefit of a little bit of slow. Because, when I was hopping on a plane every month, swapping countries, and up all night in both time zones, trying to do everything and be everything, that certainly shortened my patience and my creativity and my purposefulness. And so I think one of the things that I've benefited from with COVID is seeing what it's being forced to see what it's like to lead with a little bit of slow, and it has helped me immensely. Another thing that it gave me the opportunity to do in time was I'd always invested in the team first, not myself. And I know everybody talks about that lovely phrase of put on your own mask before you help others. But in reality, when given a budget for training or having a budget for training, I'm going to put that into the team because, for me, it was all about putting them first. And so for the first time, when we went into COVID, I thought this is actually a really good opportunity for me to do some leadership training. And so I went and did a course with a crowd called Play. And it was a really instrumental time for me to learn about myself. And you have to, as a founder, you have to sort of reinvent your leadership as you go through this journey, because you go from being one person at a kitchen table to a few people in a pitch to a team with a few employees for the first time to suddenly having this pressure of huge customers and investors and a team and all the rest of it. And so it really provided a moment to stop and reflect on that and to think purposefully about what kind of leader I wanted to be and to develop some of the soul searching that you need to do that. And I'd always thought that was sort of very practical leadership skills. And I learned through doing that a lot of it is about getting to know your own soul and getting comfortable with all the dark and messy parts of it, and then working out how you lead with those on your back and your vision of the future. And so I think that helped a lot with this question of mental health, because I think when you're leading a team, you bear the burden of others, of shareholders, of customers, of employees, of fellow founders, and that's where stress and anxiety can come from for you. And so coming at that with purpose and coming with a little bit of slow can help you with that resilience to last the journey, because otherwise you do something for a year or two and you burn out, right? And you can see that in people everywhere that we're in the period of, what is it called, the Great Resignation, of pretty much 80% of the population are going through some level of that experience at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, individually you'd have to I think you'd be challenged not to see it as a great thing in terms of some people looking and having had a little bit of slow to figure out that they weren't really doing things that aligned with their original purpose, or they've refined it and they take the opportunity. Painful if you're an employer, but let's just hope we're all a better place for it. I think that's great perspective. Angie, we've got 3 minutes to go, and the questions I always end on are biggest challenges ahead and biggest opportunities for you and the Dexibit team.
Goodness. I think for us, the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity ahead is that as our industry recovers, it is going to look different to what it did in the past. It is filled with new people, because a lot of people left our sector during the pandemic, some of them involuntarily at the beginning, and then more through the changes of the last few years. And so there's a fresh injection of fresh blood into the industry, which is wonderful for passion and creativity. But they're going to bring about change in this industry. It's had a come to Jesus moment over the last few years with things like Black Lives Matter and sort of speaking truth to power, and all of these sorts of societal changes have been experienced intensely in the cultural sector. It has gone through changes of doing things in a far more digital sense, as many industries have, and it has gone through an enormous financial upset, which will take many years to recover from. And so our customers and what they need from us is a product that will be very, very different to what it looked like going in. And so we will have to relearn that as we come into it, to be a different company. And we have recently changed our brand to reflect, this next generation of our products. And I think that will be a continuing journey for us in taking that new vision for our business forward, forever changed by COVID, into the future.
Interesting times as always, but sounds like you've well and truly thought about what the big ones are going to be for you and the team. Angie, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure, personally, just catching up with your journey, as I say, since a long time ago. I mean, I know we've seen each other backwards and forwards, but just really having the opportunity to have the privilege to spend an hour just listening a little bit more deeply to your thoughts and where Dexibit has ended up and where it's going to is incredibly exciting. So thank you very much for spending the time. Thanks to T3 community for tuning in. As you know, if you think someone would gain great insights out of listening to this, it will be on demand in about 90 minutes time on our T3 website. And we hope you join us next week. We continue to celebrate female founders, originally in support of the Electrify Aotearoa conference, which unfortunately had to be again rescheduled due to current conditions. But we'll have the fantastic Emily Blythe with us next week. So do tune in for that. Angie, thank you so much. And everybody else, enjoy your week and enjoy your weekend. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for having me, John.
See you later.